Hi everyone, this is Bruce Moravchik, coordinator of the NOAA Climate Stewards Education Project, along with Peg Steffen and Molly Harrison. We are really pleased to bring you our May webinar, Blue Carbon, Green Infrastructure, Biodiversity and Human Health, Science to Support Coastal Conservation and Resilience, presented by Dr. Ariana Sutton-Greer. We're going to go through a few bookkeeping slides as usual, and then we'll get on with our presentation, for which I am very excited this evening. As many of you know who have been with us before, tonight's broadcast is being recorded. We'll be having links to a video archive distributed within a week. If you don't receive a link to the archive in a week, please send me an email with the subject Request May 2017 Webinar. Now, a video archive and all of the slides presented this evening and of previous broadcasts going back many years are available on the NOAA Climate Stewards Google website. If you can't access the site, please send an automated access request through Google, or please send me an email directly with the subject Request Access to CSEP Google site. I'll do my best to get you connected as soon as possible. For those of you who are with us the entire time, we will be issuing you a certificate of attendance, acknowledging 1 hour of professional development through the NOAA Climate Stewards Project. As you should know, all attendee microphones are muted during the broadcast. If you'd like to ask a question to either Dr. Sutton-Greer or to one of the NOAA Climate Stewards staff, please type it in to your GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Now, during tonight's broadcast, you'll receive an email with a link to a post-webinar poll. We really appreciate you going to your email, opening it up, and clicking on this link, answering the poll. It does provide us with important metrics and helps us to prepare for future events. Hey, and save the date. 1 month from now, Monday, June 5th at 7:30, we'll be having our next webinar. I have some announcements of some professional development opportunities that are coming up, as well as some other things at the end of this broadcast, so don't leave us. On May 13th, NOAA and NSTA are working together to bring you the Dynamic Ocean, a half-day virtual conference. It's going to be all online. We're going to be focusing on Oceanography 101 and climate, sea level rise, changing ocean chemistry, coral reef bleaching, and species migration and changing fisheries. This is going to be on Saturday from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Now, NSTA is doing this, and with your registration, for which there is a cost, you will have access to all the conference webinar archives to watch on demand whenever you like. In addition, all participants are going to be receiving a copy of the Ocean's Effect of Weather and Climate SciPack with their registration, which is an $18 value. And you don't need to be a member of NSTA to get this. And finally, there is an optional certificate of attendance participation, which is available for a small additional fee. I believe it's around $10. And while the virtual conference is designed for teachers of grades 5 through 9, teachers of all levels are welcome to register. Also, I'd like to announce that on June 8th through 10th, the Hawaii Environmental Education in a Changing Climate Symposium will be held in collaboration with the Hawaii Environmental Educators Association. And on July 11th, that will be on the Big Island of Hawaii. On July 11th through the 13th, we'll be holding the webinar. We'll be holding the workshop Resilience. It's not just surviving the zombie apocalypse. That will be in Groton, Connecticut. On July 20th through the 22nd, we have another workshop, Engaging Youth in STEM and Community Resilience. That'll be in Fairbanks, Alaska. And in August, from the 8th through the 10th, NOAA and Made Clear will be holding a Climate Education Academy in Towson, Maryland. In addition to the face-to-face activities, there will also be a series of coordinated virtual experiences like this webinar. If you want some more info and you're not already signed up to the NOAA Climate Stewards list, please do so. I'll be sending out more details about each of these individually all this week. So don't miss this opportunity. And now I'd like to turn the comm over to Dr. Greer, Sutton Greer, and introduce her formally. Well, Dr. Ariana Sutton Greer is an ecosystem ecologist with expertise in wetland ecology and restoration, biodiversity, biogeochemistry, climate change, and ecosystem services. A research faculty member at the University of Maryland in the Earth System Science Interdisciplinary Center, she also serves as the Ecosystem Science Advisor for NOAA's National Ocean Service. She holds honors bachelor's degrees from Oregon State University in environmental science as well as international studies, and she holds her doctoral degree from Duke University in ecology. Her research interests include the relationships between nature, biodiversity, human health, coastal blue carbon, and natural and nature-based coastal resilience strategies. A former Smithsonian Fellow and AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow, Dr. Sutton Greer was recently selected as an Early Career Fellow by the Ecological Society of America, and one of her papers won the ESA's 2016 Innovations in Sustainability Science Award. She gets especially excited about seeking and discovering innovative opportunities to combine science and policy to solve environmental problems and promote ecosystem conservation. She's authored over 30 publications in many environmental policy journals, and her research has been featured in news stories as well as children's science TV shows. Now, if you'd like more information and links to Dr. Sutton Greer's research, teaching, education, and outreach activities, you can go to her website, suttongreer.org. And with that, Dr. Sutton Greer, the mic is yours. Take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Bruce. I am really excited to be here tonight with everybody and looking forward to all these topics we're going to talk about tonight. But I'm actually going to start with a slightly different intro, and this is one I have developed recently after the election when I realized that many of us, all of us, probably need to be doing a much better job communicating our neighbors, our friends, our students, everybody, our family members, about climate change. And so I wanted to show this group in particular the set of slides I've pulled together to try to tell that story quickly and mostly in imagery to try to help people understand what is it and why is it so important. So we're going to start there tonight. And I love this image taken by NASA because it shows obviously the beauty of the planet, but if you look at that hazy area right around the outside of the globe, it really shows you our atmosphere. And when you look at it this way, you can really see, one, how small it is. It's very, very thin, and it actually looks kind of fragile, like something that one might actually be able to impact. And yet it's that atmosphere that makes this planet habitable for us and for all living things. So it's an incredibly important part of what makes Earth, Earth. So when we're thinking about what's in the atmosphere, one of the things in the atmosphere is carbon dioxide. And I think what really starts to frustrate people about climate change is they understand sort of a little bit about carbon dioxide, and one of the messages I like to send is that carbon dioxide is not inherently bad. What you see happening here, and when I'm giving this to a live audience, I actually ask people, what's going on here? What are they doing? And the answer is all of those animals you see, including the person eating hot dogs, is they're eating or they're respiring. They're doing aerobic respiration is how a biogeochemist would talk about that. And so they are taking food, here shown by a simple sugar, but food, combining it with oxygen and producing CO2. So here's one way in which we all use CO2 every single day. And again, it's not inherently bad. Okay, so then, and again, with a live audience, and I love asking this of a mixed audience, panicky faces, particularly those who haven't had high school biology in a long time, and actually it's typically a high schooler who's able to answer this right off the bat. Oh, that's photosynthesis going on. And again, carbon dioxide plays a really important role in photosynthesis. Combine it with water and energy, obviously, from the sun's light, and this is what plants are doing that forms the basis of all of our food chains on the planet, basically. And so you then are creating that simple sugar again and oxygen. So again, carbon dioxide, very important process that we all depend on in order to be able to eat. All right, so it's also, as I mentioned, one of the primary gases in our atmosphere. And again, not inherently bad. It's actually incredibly important for making the Earth habitable. You've probably heard about the greenhouse effect. And that's the process by which these gases actually trap some sunlight that hits the Earth and reflects back into the atmosphere. Some of it gets trapped by that atmosphere, by that CO2 and other gases, again, creating a temperature on Earth that makes this planet livable, at least on most parts of the planet. So again, a very important role for carbon dioxide. So what's really happening then with climate change? The problem here is that we are burning a whole bunch of old carbon that was taken up and stored by plants a very long time ago, that got buried underground, and that turned into things like oil and gas that have been buried a long time ago, millions of years ago in the Earth. We're now pumping it out, burning it, and that's the problem. So it's too much carbon dioxide, and it's really too much of that old carbon that is a bad thing. And the best evidence, some of the best evidence I know of this actually occurring is the Keeling curve. Now, I love to tell the story. So this was a postdoctoral project for Keeling, and he started measuring the CO2 levels at the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. If we were able to zoom in right there at the very first part of that, he thought he was having instrumentation problems when that curve started to go up. And then the curve started to go down, and he thought, oh my gosh, now what's going on with the instruments? Like, what is going on? And he thought, well, this is going to be the shortest postdoc ever because everything's going wrong, and I don't know what's going on. And then it started to go back up again. And he started to realize, oh my gosh, I'm seeing a potential pattern here. And sure enough, lo and behold, now we've got those data going back all the way to 1960 that actually show that up and down every single year. And what's really neat here is what we're really seeing is the Earth breathing the same way we breathe. This is the Earth breathing, and except it happens in a seasonal way. And so because there's more land mass in the northern hemisphere and more plants in the northern hemisphere, when the plants green up right now during this time of year, as we hit spring and then into summer, the plants are all greening up and they're taking up a whole bunch of CO2, which actually creates that dip in the atmosphere that you see. And as we hit our fall in the northern hemisphere, then the plants, many of the plants, start to lose their leaves, and you have decomposition occurring of those leaves, and a bunch of that carbon gets decomposed by microbes and returns to the atmosphere. And that's how you get that little up and down, up and down, up and down every year. So that's the background. That's what's happening. That's the Earth breathing every year. And then what you see on top of that is that steady mounting increase. That is the increase due to the burning of that old carbon. So otherwise you'd be seeing that up and down, and it would be flat if we weren't adding any CO2 to the atmosphere. So let's step back even farther, because this is what really helps to put things into perspective. So you often hear one of the reasons that some people deny that climate change is happening is because they say there's a lot of variability in atmospheric CO2 or atmospheric gases in general. And I wholeheartedly agree with them. This is actually data showing you mostly ice core data all the way back 800,000 years ago. And then the very, very, very tiny end part is actually Mauna Loa data added on to the end there. And I will definitely not deny that there is a lot of variability going on in the Earth's CO2 concentration, shown here on the y-axis. But what I think is really powerful is to note that in that 800,000 year period, even though CO2 levels have gone up and down repeatedly, they have never been anywhere near what they are today. And you can really see that we are in an anomalous pattern where suddenly it's going up and up and up, and there is no sign of it turning around. So yes, CO2 levels are variable in history, but they aren't variable like we're seeing today, like the extreme value we are seeing today. And I think this is a really beautiful image for people who are really visual learners, because this shows you starting way back in the 1850s in the top left corner and going all the way down to 2016 or 17, I think, in the bottom right there. Global temperature changes. So this is the difference from the mean over time from 1850 all the way to 2016. And really all you have to do is start to see that back in the 1850s through the 1900s, mostly you're seeing, a little bit cold, a little bit hot, changes in those temperatures each year a little bit, but then you start getting into the 1900s and a lot of the blue goes away and you start seeing nothing but red. And by the 90s and the 2000s and the 2010s, you're seeing not just basically all red, but you're seeing lots of red, which means lots of warming temperatures for the entire globe. And I think this is a really powerful image for those who aren't sure if we really are seeing changes in temperature. Okay, so that's some of the basic intro to climate change I have used effectively in communicating to a wide variety of audiences. If that's helpful to any of you, please feel free to consider using those slides in any of your educational or other opportunities to talk about climate change with people. Today I'm going to focus mostly on coastal communities climate change, and one of the major things that we're dealing with there are issues of sea level rise and storm surge. So we'll be talking a little bit more about that today. But I wanted to set the stage. This is a paper by colleagues and a friend of mine, Katie Arkema, came out in Nature Climate Change, where they were looking at the exposure of the U.S. coastline and coastal populations to sea level rise by 2100. And what you need to take away from the image first is that we've got blue, yellow, and red, blue showing the lowest coastal hazard index, red showing the highest. So the majority of where we see coastal hazard index affecting people by 2100 is on the East Coast and in the Gulf. Primarily, but also other parts of the country. And then if you take a look at those bars in the center of the graph, they actually did the analysis and they looked at how many people, population in thousands, so you've got sort of hundreds of thousands on that y-axis, how many people would be impacted by sea level rise in 2100 if there were habitats present, so coastal ecosystems present, those are the black bars, and then if those habitats were lost, and that's the white bars. If we lose coastal habitats, there's going to be more people at risk of sea level rise. And in some cases, like California, Florida, New Jersey, and New York in particular, the population that's exposed goes significantly up when we lose those coastal habitats. So this was one of the publications that came out recently really suggesting there's an important role for our coastal ecosystems. This is really recent. This was in the New York Times April 18th, and it was an article all about when rising seas transform risk into certainty. And I thought the tagline was fascinating. Along parts of the East Coast, the entire system of insuring coastal property is beginning to break down. So another thing you often hear about climate change, particularly from those who don't really want to deal with it, is it's not happening yet. No, I don't know anybody who's affected by it. And the answer is, actually, you probably do, because if you happen to know anybody who lives in a coastal area, many of our coastal communities are already feeling this, and this may include many of you out there, where flooding is not just an issue when we're facing major storms these days. It's actually becoming a much more regular problem. And this article had this interesting statement. I hadn't really heard this before, but flooding is the most common and most expensive natural disaster in the United States. So this is already a problem that we are dealing with. This isn't climate change is going to be a problem in 100 years. It's like, no, climate change is a problem right now for a number of people. This paper is also very recent, or a couple papers that have come out really recently in AGU's Earth's Future. And this is actually dealing with what I was starting to talk about there, where it isn't just the extreme events like Hurricane Sandy or Katrina, for example, but we're starting to have problems with flooding that we call nuisance flooding. This is the blue skies flooding, the flooding that can occur when there's actually no storm. It's just that we get particular high tides. And this article, one about was just the cumulative cost of nuisance flooding may actually exceed the costs of extreme events like hurricanes. And yet, as a society, we aren't very prepared for that. And an example they gave in the paper was Washington, D.C. between 1930 and 1970 was experiencing about 19 hours of nuisance flooding. Now, that was spread over several days, but about 19 hours. It's increased in the last 2 decades to be more like 94 hours, and it's predicted by 2050 that it could be as high as 700 hours a year. So that is lots and lots of days per year where people will be dealing with nuisance flooding on a very regular basis. Okay, so that brings me to the work I've been working on, which is really to try to figure out how my background in ecosystem ecology and restoration can potentially be used to support the management of our coastal communities and ecosystems, policy, and conservation where possible. So tonight we're going to talk about three things: coastal blue carbon, natural or green infrastructure, and also hybrid infrastructure, and then lastly, the nature, biodiversity, and human health relationship. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So I don't know how many of you have ever heard the term coastal blue carbon. For many people, it is a brand new thing they've never heard of. And so just to make sure we're all on the same playing field, I'm going to make sure you know what I'm talking about when I say coastal wetland blue carbon. So when we talk about green carbon, there's a little bit of a rainbow here. When we talk about green carbon, we're talking about the carbon that's taken up and stored in terrestrial plants like forests or grasslands. Now, when we talk about black carbon, that's the carbon that either is produced from when we burn fossil fuels or in the production of fossil fuels, and also the carbon that is produced when we have land use change and, for example, we're burning our forests or our grasslands, etc. So that's all black carbon. So then we get to blue carbon. And it's called blue carbon because we're trying to equate it in people's minds with coasts and oceans. So this is the carbon that is taken up and stored in coastal and marine ecosystems. So the fraction of this is coastal blue carbon piece. So this is the carbon taken up and stored in salt marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses. So where are these ecosystems all around the world? Turns out it's really kind of cool. They're pretty much everywhere in the world, except maybe the very poles. And so what you see here is seagrass in green and salt marsh in yellow and mangroves in orange. So mangroves are tropical, so they're going to be in the tropical areas. But what you can really see is that there are these ecosystems pretty much on every continent spread around the world. Now, so what's the really big deal? Why are we suddenly talking about coastal blue carbon? Well, the reason we're talking about it is that it's been fairly recently realized that coastal habitats take up or sequester a whole lot of carbon. So what you're seeing in this graphic here is on the y-axis, you're seeing the carbon burial rate in soils. And then on the x-axis, you're seeing the three forest types, tropical, boreal, and temperate, on the left, and then salt marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses on the right. And I want you to note the log scale on the y-axis. That means that wetland ecosystems, salt marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses, are actually taking up over 10 times as much carbon on a per area basis than those forested systems. So what that means is that even though these coastal habitats represent a much smaller area of the world, they are an approximately equivalent, meaning approximately the same order of magnitude annual sink to our forested systems. All right, so if you think about, here I'll go back just for a second, if you think about carbon and equate it to your bank account, think about your bank account as carbon in instead of dollars in. And this is what's going into your account every year, okay? So that matters, but as all of us also recognize, it matters also not just what's in your checking account, but what's in your savings account. What's been there for a while that you're counting on or that you're just storing away and not planning to spend. Well, so in the case of these coastal habitats, that's what we're looking at here, because this is the carbon in these systems. And so what you're seeing is CO2 equivalents, tons of CO2 equivalents on this x-axis, and you see tropical forest in the bottom, and then those wetland ecosystems in the top bars. First thing I want you to recognize is brown is the carbon stored in soils, green is the carbon stored in biomass, like wood, trees, for example. And so if you look at that tropical forest bar, the majority of the carbon in a tropical forest is stored in the trees, in the biomass, in that green bar. And this is probably no surprise to anyone because we know there's a lot of wood in a tropical forest. And I think, honestly, this is why everybody has been thinking about forests as really important natural sinks. We can see the carbon in these systems. We actually see that it's there. Now, if you take a look at the wetland systems, the first thing to notice, of course, is that the majority of the carbon is in the soils. And so the carbon is in a place where we don't see it. It's underground, But if you look at the length of those bars, in many cases, they actually are storing far more carbon, or at least as much, as many of our tropical forest systems. And so again, I think this is part of the reason why wetlands, coastal wetlands are becoming part of climate mitigation discussions now, but have not always been part of those discussions, because we can't see where the majority of the carbon is in these systems because it's below ground. Now, another note here. Carbon stored in soils tends to be very old carbon. To get a full meter of carbon stored, you're often talking hundreds of years, maybe even 1,000. And this is a conservative estimate because many of these coastal wetland systems we know are multiple meters deep, at least 2 or 3 meters, some of them 5 or 6 meters deep. And this is only showing you a carbon comparison for that top meter of soil. So if anything, this is a very conservative estimate of how much carbon is in the bank account, if you will, of these systems. All right, so carbon really it's actually, of course, not blue, it's brown because it's being stored as old organic matter in these soils. So this is a salt marsh up at the Wacoit Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve in Massachusetts. And this is the salt marsh vegetation on top of that really carbon-rich dark brown soil that extends many meters down in this case. So of course, it's a bit of a misnomer that it's blue carbon because it really is brown. And I've been asked by people, so is there purple carbon, is there pink carbon? Not so far. But so how does this really work? Why are these systems really good carbon sinks? So this is a graphic from a paper that I helped to co-author recently. And what I want you to take away from this is, like any vegetated system, you have CO2 coming in and being taken up by the plants. That's the green arrow in. But you also have some being respired by the plants because they're growing and respiring just the way any organism is. And so that's the little black bar headed back out of the plants. But in this case, a whole bunch of that carbon is making its way into either woody tissue, as you can see in the mangrove red arrow there, sequestration into woody biomass, or into the soils. We're getting sequestration into the soils. And so it's that red arrow in all three systems that's really the key here, where this is why they're such good sequesters of carbon. And the reason that the carbon stays buried in these soils is these systems stay wet. They are inundated with seawater, ocean water, usually tidally influenced or completely covered most of the time, as in the case of seagrasses. And so they stay wet, they stay anaerobic. There's not a lot of oxygen in these soils, and that is a very good way to bury and keep carbon stored for long periods of time. So what happens if we disturb or degrade or destroy these systems, either by modifying the hydrology, for example, by draining these systems, or by cutting them down, well, what you find is not only have you lost that pathway in, all those red arrows are gone, right? We're no longer sequestering carbon, but we've actually now created new sources of carbon because now that stored carbon that was in the soils or in the biomass, in the case of the mangroves in particular, that's now being burned off because you have disturbed the hydrology on the system to a point where now you're probably getting more oxygen into the system. And as a result, you are losing not only the ability to sequester carbon, but you're starting to lose those hundreds or thousands of years worth of buried carbon that were in the soil. So what is a tremendous natural sink becomes an additional human source of greenhouse gases when we degrade or destroy these coastal wetlands. Okay, so why is this such a big deal? Well, because unfortunately, these coastal systems are some of the most threatened ecosystems on the planet. Global rates of loss range from about 0.7 to 7% of their global area per year. And so again, as I said, these impressive sinks become sources. One estimate says that coastal carbon emissions could be as high as 19% of those from deforestation. I think it's easier to think of this statistic that I heard from Conservation International recently, which is that the loss of blue carbon coastal wetlands is about the equivalent annual emissions of the United Kingdom. So on a global scale, the loss of these ecosystems everywhere is about the same as a country's emissions. So this is a globally relevant amount of an emission that we need to be tracking. So my work at NOAA basically has been focusing on what are the opportunities for leveraging this blue carbon service. Now that we better understand the important role these wetlands play in climate mitigation, How can we use that in mitigation, adaptation, or coastal conservation policies? What are our opportunities? So one of the first things I was asked by NOAA leadership about 6 years ago, when NOAA was first starting to think about what kind of work we might want to do in this area, was, okay, well, do we account for this in our policies? And if we don't, could we? Small looked at, could we include this benefit, this service, in things like our Clean Water Act, or our Natural Resources Damage Assessment, Coastal Zone Management Act, or the National Environmental Policy Act? And what we determined is that the carbon services are not currently being included in most cases, but that they could be, and that they probably should be, because the spirit of all this legislation, most of it written a while ago, so before we were really talking about ecosystem services specifically, but much of it talks about the importance of protecting functioning ecosystems and all the functions of an ecosystem. So that really captures the essence of this carbon benefit. The other important thing we learned is that the incorporation of carbon services could lead to more habitat conservation and climate mitigation, and I want to give you an example of that. So for example, when we do a Clean Water Act assessment, we're going to have an impact on a wetland somewhere, and we're trying to figure out how much mitigation needs to occur in order to offset that impact to a wetland. We tend to focus on the living resources. So we think about, for example, how many hectares of salt marsh are going to be disturbed, and maybe that's going to impact, for example, a certain number of birds' nests or a certain amount of fishery habitat, and we try to offset that living resource and figure out what our restoration should be. That usually means our restoration ratios are something like 2 to 1 or 3 to 1. Now, if we were to actually include the fact that in disturbing those 2 to 3 acres, say, of wetland, we're going to lose 1,000 years worth of soil carbon we hadn't previously realized. To offset that, we're probably looking at mitigation ratios that might be as high as 20 to 1, 50 to 1. Nobody does this right now. And so as a result, this really opens the door that if we focus on not just the living resources, but also that benefit that the soil is providing, we could actually be leading to more conservation and more climate mitigation. Now, this was all hypothetical, these first analyses, so we want to try and take this to the next step and implement it. And so we had the opportunity at Sears Point, which is in the California, San Francisco Bay Area. They were going to do a National Environmental Policy Act, a NEPA environmental assessment for a restoration project there. And we worked on the document and looked at all the different restoration scenarios and calculated what would be the carbon benefits of those different restoration scenarios. And that was actually part of the environmental assessment that then went through some public comment and has now been finalized. So we saw this as a really important first step in terms of setting a precedent, saying, hey, we can consider carbon as in one of these processes, these environmental compliance processes. And look, we've already done it. Here's an example. The really great story was that as my colleague and I were doing this, we were working with the Restoration Center at NOAA, and the folks in the Restoration Center said, hey, we're actually right now redoing our Programmatic Environmental Impact Statement, or PEIS, which is the document that guides all of our restoration work, and it would make sense for you guys to help us include carbon into that document so that it becomes part of what we consider for certain projects. Now, in this case, we make it very clear you don't necessarily want to consider the carbon benefits of every project. Really, coastal wetlands are one of the places where you have a very big natural carbon sink, but you don't necessarily need to be doing this for all projects. And we make that clear in this document. But it's really exciting that now this document, which has also been through public comment and has been completed and is available on NOAA's website, it includes carbon benefits as one of the things you can be thinking about when you are planning restoration, for example. So this was an example of how we actually took it from hypothetical to beginning to inform actual implementation of our U.S. environmental policies. All right, so at the same time I've been working on that, there was stuff moving at the national level too. So we had the Priority Agenda for Climate Resilience of America's Natural Resources. This came out under the Obama administration. A bunch of other people to develop the U.S. mid-century strategy for decarbonization. Now, this was a very exciting document to work on because it really was saying, okay, the U.S. we know is one of the major emitters of greenhouse gases, but if we really want to get serious about deep decarbonization, how can we do it? What are the strategies that we as a country can implement? And we included a small section on coastal wetlands and restoration and protection of those wetlands in this strategy. Now, realistically, this strategy is probably not going anywhere over the next few years, but it is my hope that this strategy will at some point be revived, and that all the work that many of us put into that document will actually still be capitalized on at some point. But I am very excited that coastal wetlands also, over the past 2 years, NOAA has been supporting and working with a bunch of other agencies and academics and nonprofits to get coastal wetlands included in our U.S. National Greenhouse Gas Inventory for the very first time. That just a little ago is available on EPA's website. You can get there by the link at the bottom there. And what's really exciting about this step is not just that we've done it. We are one of only about 5 countries around the world that responded to a call from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to begin to try and implement including wetlands in our inventory. They asked us to try doing this. It was not a requirement, and the U.S. is one of a few countries that did this. And we will now have to keep doing this, because once you include something in your inventory, every year thereafter you have to track it, which means the U.S. is going to have to do a better job of monitoring where we're doing restoration and where we're losing wetlands, coastal wetlands, so that we can include that in either our sinks or our emissions factors in the inventory going forward into the foreseeable future. So I'm very excited on the progress there, because this is not something that can be undone or will change no matter what else is going on across the government. Okay, at the same time, because we don't have a U.S. compliance market at the national scale, there's been some efforts supported by NOAA and others to include coastal wetlands in the voluntary carbon market. And it's very exciting that we now have a verified carbon standard, VCS, methodology that allows you to get carbon credits for coastal wetland restoration, and this includes seagrasses or salt marsh mangroves, etc., anywhere in the world. So anyone can use that methodology, which was validated and completely done and available online as of November 2015. And then it's very exciting to me that right now we have a VCS methodology for carbon credits for the protection of coastal wetlands that is in review, and that has just gone through its first public review comment period, and hopefully will be available, I'm hoping, by the end of 2017, so that you can get credits for protecting a threatened wetland instead of having to wait for it to get destroyed and then planning to restore it. Because really you get the biggest bang for your buck in these systems if you never let that initial degradation, which leads to the soil, let degradation happen in the first place. Okay, another message I think is really important, particularly right now as things are uncertain moving forward in the federal government, is that there's a lot that can be happening at the local and state and regional level as well. And this is actually where we probably are going to see the most amazing progress over the next 4 years, hopefully setting the stage for national action in the future. So an example I want to give is California's Assembly Bill AB 32. This was passed in 2006. It was called the Global Warming Solutions Act, and California committed to reducing to 1990 emissions levels by 2020. And they said, all right, we're going to do this using a variety of approaches, including policies, regulation, and market-based approaches. So the market-based approach is a cap-and-trade program, which began in 2012, and companies that need to can offset 8% of their compliance requirements using offsets. Now, an offset is where you pay to have some other place do the carbon sink or sequestration. So in this case, the offsets available are currently forestry, dairy digesters, and the destruction of ozone-depleting substances. The money that they pay to do this goes into their greenhouse gas reduction fund in California. And California is really being somewhat innovative with those greenhouse gas reduction funds. So in the spring of 2015, they funded 12 projects, and this included 4 coastal wetland projects, one of them in Elkhorn Slough, which is pictured here. And my hope is that those projects are going to help to demonstrate that at some point in the future it might be possible to have wetland offsets as well if they can gather the data from those projects that provides enough confidence that when we do these projects we can restore carbon sinks and actually get those carbon benefits that we're seeking. So again, this is a really exciting regional example of progress at a time when I know it is hard for a lot of us because we're not seeing the kind of federal progress we might have hoped for, but there's still a lot that can be done at the state and local level. So I encourage you all to support your state and local initiatives. Okay. I also had a student work with me looking at international policy and blue carbon projects. And what she came to is that there's actually a fair amount of interest in leveraging this blue carbon in order to do restoration and then to promote community resilience. So a lot of communities are really interested in restoring mangroves as a way of helping to protect their communities from things like erosion and waves. So it basically provides climate adaptation. At the same time, you can provide climate mitigation. And in these cases, it provides livelihood creation. In a lot of these villages, there are not a lot of job opportunities, particularly for women. And women have become very involved in these projects, helping to grow and maintain the seedlings, as you see in that upper right picture at a site in India, and also to help actually do citizen science, where they are helping to restore and plant the mangroves, and then also to track them, to measure them and make sure that they are growing appropriately, etc. And that's what you see in those lower two pictures. So I find this incredibly exciting. That at least in some cases, blue carbon is leading to lifting the entire community up, providing job opportunities, tourism, recreation opportunities, at the same time that it's providing carbon finance to support the community and providing, obviously, that blue carbon benefit. Okay, so just a couple more things, because I know this audience has a real intrigue sometimes with some of the sciencey stuff. What's going on here? Well, so there's some really cool cutting edge research that we don't have a lot of data on yet, so I see this as a frontier here. But recall that for ocean acidification, any greenhouse gas sink is good for reducing ocean acidification, because basically carbon mixes globally, so any carbon we take out of the atmosphere helps to prevent ocean acidification, which we know is one of our big stressors on our oceans right now. So in this case, though, there's actually evidence that there could be a link between blue carbon systems and ocean acidification. So for example, there's evidence that seagrass beds can act as an ocean acidification refuge. And so there's been some work on this in a couple different places in the country, but there's a panel, a blue ribbon panel in Washington State that looked at this, and they found that eelgrass was able to raise the pH, right? And you're raising the pH, which means it's becoming less acidic. And that's because these plants are actually drawing CO2 levels down by taking CO2 out of the water column through photosynthesis. And so there's going to have that affect clam growth inside and outside the eelgrass beds. Now, this is still very cutting edge and new, as I mentioned, but there's real interest in how much blue carbon habitats might be able to buffer some of our shellfish and or our coral reefs to provide that extra protection from ocean acidification. Then in addition, there was this recent paper just a few weeks ago in Science that looked at seagrass and disease prevention. And so what this paper found is that there was a 50% reduction in the abundance of potential bacterial pathogens, these pathogens that cause diseases in both humans and marine organisms, when seagrass was present. So when there was seagrass, there was this reduction in these pathogens. And that's what this graph shows you. So 2 of the 5 global coral diseases were significantly reduced in corals adjacent to seagrass. So what you see in the black bars is the mean coral disease prevalence in percent in the black bars where there was no seagrass, and then in the white bars where there was seagrass present. And so this is really exciting because this is drawing a link then between the presence of seagrasses and both marine organismal and human health. And the researchers actually came up with this question partly because they were diving in certain areas and they got sick afterwards. And they started to ask, why are we getting sick in certain places and not others? And at least right now there appears to be a link between seagrasses. Now the exact mechanism of how this is working has yet to be worked out. But this is incredibly exciting and very cutting edge. Blue carbon co-benefits. So coastal wetland blue carbon, it's a triple win in my opinion. You get the climate mitigation, you get the climate adaptation, and then you have all these benefits of conservation. And those co-benefits now, as we're looking here, include things like potential implications for improving human health, which is super exciting. So I tend to call coastal blue carbon the best climate change mitigation and adaptation opportunity that you've never heard of, except that now all of you have. And I hope that you will be sharing this information with your friends and colleagues and students. All right. So we are going to then, and that actually takes me to, remember, all these co-benefits that we get, things like recreational opportunities and habitat for important species and storm and erosion risk reduction. these are the co-benefits you get because when you protect the carbon in the system, you are protecting a healthy, intact coastal wetland. And so that takes me very nicely to my second topic, which is natural or green infrastructure. So Hurricane Sandy was, I believe, a turning point in the way the federal government is thinking about resilience, on coastal resilience, but also how we approach coastal resilience. So in the past, when you thought about needing to protect a community from storm surge, waves, etc., this was always what people thought of: gray or built infrastructure, seawalls, riprap, levees, dikes, etc. And don't get me wrong, there will probably always be a role for these kinds of systems when we're thinking about some of our coastal resilience needs. However, what's really exciting is that post-Hurricane Sandy, there has been a real growing interest in what's the role of natural or green infrastructure in providing coastal resilience. And here we're talking about healthy coastal habitats like marshes, coral and oyster reefs, mangroves, beaches and dunes, and barrier islands. And so I was actually asked by my leadership to investigate this and come up with what's the state of our science on how these systems work. So how do these systems work to provide wave attenuation and erosion risk reduction? So if you look at the top graph here, you see that as the waves have to go over the oyster reef and then through all that vegetation in the tidal marsh, that wave height is decreasing and decreasing and decreasing, so that by the time it reaches land, those waves have lost a lot of their energy. Now, if you look at the bottom graph, it's exactly the opposite. We have degraded oyster reefs and almost no tidal marsh, and those waves just basically keep on crashing all the way until they reach the coastal community, and of course then you end up with potential flooding. So that's how natural infrastructure works. Here is another example of a study that actually tried to quantify this, and they spent a lot of time. There's a really neat video online, if you have any interest in checking it out, of how they actually brought a chunk of tidal marsh into this huge flume where they could basically run a whole bunch of waves over it and measure what was going on. And so this showed, this particular graphic, this project showed that up to 60% of wave reduction can be attributed to vegetation. Even when the vegetation had broken completely in half, which you see sort of in that bottom graphic there in the picture, the marsh substrate, the soil, remained stable even once the waves had broken the stems. And they were really throwing big waves at this system. So they concluded that the effectiveness of storm wave dissipation and the resilience of tidal marshes, even at extreme conditions, suggests that salt marsh ecosystems can be a valuable component of coastal protection schemes. Now, what was really important about this paper was it began to truly quantify how much wave reduction can we actually expect from a natural system like a salt marsh. And the reason that's important is that when we have communities that need protection, engineers typically are involved in helping to think about things like dikes or seawalls, and they have very specific models and measurements of how much wave reduction you get for what kind of structure and what height of structure, etc. We do not currently have the same kinds of comparable data for natural systems. So this kind of study is starting to build that database better understand what we expect is the storm risk reduction or the wave attenuation that we can get from a natural system. Okay, so in my review of what we know about our state of the knowledge, there are many factors that influence the amount of coastal protection you're likely to get from your natural system. So it matters how much area of habitat there is and also how much contiguous area. So if you have a salt marsh, let's say in the Gulf, but that has been cut through by multiple pipelines in order to get oil from the Gulf, you know, into the city or into the refinery, that marsh that's been cut through several times is not going to be able to provide the same amount of wave attenuation as a marsh that was never impacted, that hasn't been cut through by multiple channels. If it is a vegetated marsh, it also matters the density of the vegetation. And in the case of a reef ecosystem, that very front reef crest, the size of that reef crest for either corals or oyster reefs has an important impact on how much of that wave energy is lost as it goes over that initial reef crest. So those are some of the factors that we know. So what does it look like when I'm talking about natural infrastructure? I think it helps to have a picture in mind. So here's a community that said, wow, we really need to increase our coastal resilience. What are our options? And this community said, well, we used to have a barrier island, but it got breached in the last big storm. Let's restore our barrier island. But in addition, there's no reason we can't do a layering approach with this natural infrastructure. We used to have oyster beds. Let's see if we can restore our oyster beds, and let's make sure that we maintain that healthy salt marsh out front. And maybe we could even do some salt marsh restoration at the same time. And in essence, then create this triple natural barrier. Okay, so what are some of the benefits of this kind of an approach? Well, what's really neat about these natural systems is that they can actually strengthen with time. This is not something you can say about built infrastructure, which is strongest the day you walk away from it, and it only weakens with time as it ages. These natural systems can be self-maintaining, and they have the potential for self-repair after storms in some cases. You may not even have to go in and do maintenance after a storm. And they can also, in many cases, grow and keep pace with sea level rise. That is definitely not the case for built infrastructure. In some cases, these systems can be more cost effective, and they provide co-benefits all the time, whereas gray infrastructure only provides that storm risk reduction when a storm is approaching. So what do I mean by those co-benefits? We talked about some of these already in the section on coastal blue carbon, but we're talking about things like these coastal systems provide really important fishery habitat, supporting both our recreational and our commercial fisheries. They provide recreation and tourism opportunities. They also provide water filtration, education and cultural services, opportunities to go learn and study, and also oftentimes very important religious opportunities. They provide habitat for other species, and as we talked about in the case of wetlands, they provide very important carbon sequestration and storage. Okay, so as I was doing the research on natural infrastructure, I started to come across really exciting stuff happening in the hybrid approach. So what do I mean when I say hybrid infrastructure? Well, so this is where you combine some kind of a natural or green feature with a built or gray feature. So in this case here, you're seeing it's another community that also has these triple barriers of natural features. But in addition, this community said, well, there's some other things we can do. We can move homes away from the water. We can raise some homes up on stilts to make them less likely to flood. We also can install an operable floodgate that will then close as needed when a storm is approaching. So again, we've combined green and gray features to build this community's resilience. Now, what are the strengths here? What this allows you to do is really capitalize on the benefits provided by both green and gray. You can use gray actually to help protect the green as it establishes in some cases. But actually, I think one of the most important uses of this is you can use green infrastructure to reduce the necessary gray infrastructure that you have to build. So if you are going to build a seawall, if you have natural infrastructure have already attenuated some of the wave energy, you can build a smaller seawall, which means you can keep costs down, you can keep maintenance costs down, and so you really can benefit from both the strengths of green and gray. So I wanted to share with you some of what I think is the really cool innovation happening in these hybrid landscapes. So after Hurricane Sandy, there was this Rebuild by Design competition, and I encourage you to go look up Rebuild by Design, because there were a whole bunch of projects submitted, but 6 winners, and they're in the New York, New Jersey area. And it's very exciting to see the progress being made in the thinking about how do we become more resilient, because people are really thinking about the whole system, about the ecology, the social infrastructure, and then of course the built infrastructure. And so here's an example where this is a waterfront area where they're thinking about what else can we be doing to make ourselves more resilient. So you see permeable pavement and bioswales, you see bioretention wetlands, and you see basically a really nice use of both natural and built features in a very pedestrian and human-friendly setting. And so this is one of my very favorite projects coming out of Rebuild by Design. This one's called the Big U, and this is actually in Manhattan. And I figure if you can do this kind of work in Manhattan, which is one of the most built-up places I know, you can do it anywhere. So again, this is a combination of hard and soft, or built and natural infrastructure. And they really focused on wanting to have recreational benefits for the community of Manhattan. So it's called the Big U because if you look in the bottom picture, there's a green line that runs all around Manhattan, getting bigger at the tip and then goes along the other side. And the whole idea was that either built or more natural features would surround the entire tip of that Manhattan island. Okay, so the reality is that even the 6 winners of the Rebuild by Design competition were unable to be fully funded, and so they got partial funding. And so what is being implemented right now is the East Side Coastal Resilience Project. I think this project is really exciting. They are integrating the flood protection into the community, and at the same time they are improving water access, because this is actually a part of the coastline that had a big road running right along it, which made it very difficult for anyone to make it out to the coastline. So they are actually including, as part of the design, a lot of pedestrian crossovers so that people can actually get to this wonderful walkable coastal area that they're creating. And so what I think is so exciting about this project is Manhattan was hit fairly hard by Hurricane Sandy. You've seen probably some of those amazing photos where a good chunk of Manhattan has just gone completely black because there was no power. And instead of having the reaction of, wow, we never want to have that happen again, build us a really big seawall, protect us, shut the water out, this community said, no, actually, we would love to have better water access. We would love to be better connected. There's a reason we are a coastal community and we like living by the coast, but we still want to be more resilient. So how do we do that? And the way they're doing it is by combining berms and flood walls and barriers. So they're doing it with this built and natural approach. And I can tell you, I'm super excited to watch this project go in, so that then I can go visit and get real pictures and see how well they're managing to accomplish these dual goals. All right, here's another example of living shorelines. This is actually on NOAA property. This is a much smaller scale, so this might be a little more imaginable for many of you. Hybrids, here's an example of living shorelines. So living shorelines use a combination of habitat creation or restoration and then some kind of built infrastructure. And these are usually done to prevent erosion. So you get some of the benefits then of natural habitat. So the top photo shows you what the beach looked like before they put in the living shoreline. And this beach was eroding away, and just outside the picture on the right-hand side is a NOAA building. And so there was real need to protect something in front of that building and not just have the beach completely erode away. So what they did was establish the bottom picture, which actually is a with then an oyster sill running right along the front of the marsh, which I realize is hard to see in the picture. They actually had oyster from the site that they could use to build that sill. If they hadn't had oyster, they could have used something like concrete to build a sill, or blocks. So it could have been a little bit more built. But this has been a highly effective project where they have basically stopped the erosion using this natural or this hybrid design. So as I was developing this research and answering questions of NOAA leadership, we discovered that there are some really important research needs that will help to support policy and basically the implementation of more of these natural solutions. One example is we need to better understand the benefits provided by natural and hybrid systems. We need to actually know how much flood risk reduction occurs. We need to know the value of both those benefits and the co-benefits provided by those systems, things like fishery habitat or recreation. We need to actually have best practices for design. There is no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to these natural or hybrid opportunities, because every community has a slightly different setting and different needs. So we really need to figure out how to design different systems for different communities. And then in some cases, we need to remove hurdles for implementation. Right now, it tends to be easier to get a permit to put in a bulkhead or a seawall than it is to get a permit to put in one of these more green solutions. But there is work being done to try to facilitate the policy end of things. In fact, the Army Corps has a living shorelines regulation that is, I can't remember if it's actually implemented yet, but they have been working on that regulation that will facilitate the ability to put in living shorelines instead of other more built structures. So there is progress being made here, very exciting, but there's definitely still research to help support the implementation of these opportunities. Okay, I know it's getting late, so we're going to cover this last topic fairly quickly. So for many of us who are interested in conservation and the environment, we generally biodiversity intrinsically valuable. And that's one of the prior reasons for conserving biodiversity. There's also other reasons like the provisioning of food and medicines and climate regulation. These are all very good reasons, but I would also argue they aren't doing enough yet because we continue to lose habitats around the world at amazingly fast rates. So I'm excited that there is new evidence suggesting that there are additional reasons to preserve biodiversity. In fact, there's a really important connection to human health and well-being. If you want to think about it, our health is really sort of the ultimate ecosystem service. It's all of those other services combined in terms of that's what we really care about is human health. And when I'm talking about human health here, I'm talking really broadly. We're not just talking about the absence of disease, but really this state of physical, mental, and social well-being, and it includes things like personal security and freedom of choice, employment opportunities, educational opportunities, etc. So we're talking sort of broadly human health and well-being. And so my colleagues and I asked 3 important questions in a paper. First, was there convincing evidence that experiencing natural living can improve psychological and physical health? Does exposure to biodiverse nature result in measurable health responses? So how much does it matter whether it's just nature or whether it's biodiverse nature? And then can biodiversity provide humans and animals protection from allergic and inflammatory diseases? And so in answering that first question, yes, it's a big resounding yes. Experiencing natural settings helps reduce stress and blood pressure, it improves recovery from surgery, it improves mood and self-esteem and energy, and it decreases the prevalence of asthma and anxiety. So a big resounding yes. Then when we get to that second question about biodiversity, there's a lot less evidence here, but there is growing evidence that contact with diverse natural habitats has important positive benefits for human health. So for example, one study found that reflection and sense of identity and sense of place all increased as people experienced more plant and more bird diversity. In the only study I have really found that deals with a coastal environment at all, and it was in an aquarium setting, they found a greater decrease in heart rate or more mood with fish diversity that people were viewing. And I don't actually find that surprising, but it's so cool that they found that result. And then a preference for outdoor activity in biodiverse environments. So we have growing but still limited evidence here. Okay, getting to that third question about chronic disease and biodiversity. So it used to be that doctors thought that allergy was considered a response to exposure to too much bad stuff. And that's what has led us to having soap that has antibacterial stuff in it and all that kind of stuff everywhere. And unfortunately, we've really gone quite far in that direction. And now doctors are beginning to recognize that allergy oftentimes results from a lack of exposure to microbes. And this leads to a hyper-responsiveness of our bodies to bioparticles. So basically what this means is that microbe-rich environments actually confer health benefits to people, especially to children. And so this has really important implications. So this is called the biodiversity or hygiene hypothesis. And the idea is that as we lose macrodiversity, as we lose habitats, and as people move into the city and are no longer experiencing a bunch of natural settings, this leads to a loss of microdiversity that we're experiencing, which then leads to changes in our own human microbiota, so all the microbes living in us, and this actually results in a variety of different disorders, everything from heart disease and actually some forms of cancer potentially too. So this is one of the studies I find the most fascinating, and it's one of the easiest to explain that we cover in the paper. So this was done in Finland. It was a study of adolescents in a community. They actually studied just basically every adolescent in this one community. And what they found, they looked at kids. They looked at a 3-kilometer radius around each kid's house to figure out what kind of natural diversity were they generally experiencing. And then they also tested the kids' skin. And what they found is that tended to have environmental diversity around their house, and they had fewer kinds of good bacteria on their skin. Proteogamma bacteria is what they're called. And so basically the point of this is that the loss of contact with a diverse natural world is actually in some cases making us sick because our immune systems don't then function the way they're supposed to, and our own microbiota aren't functioning the way they're intended to. So as we were doing this, we actually discovered a bunch of research needs here, lots of research needs here. This is really a cutting-edge budding field here, which maybe some of you will like to go and start experimenting. I'm hoping I can do more work in this area too. One thing we need a better understanding is, what is the mechanism by which biodiversity is affecting human health? How does that work? And then the ecologist in me is very interested in this question. What are the best ways to measure biodiversity, particularly if we're trying to think about human exposure to that biodiversity? What metrics do we use? And then which metrics of human health would actually be the best indicators of that biodiversity-human health relationship? So we're going to be responsive to that biodiversity exposure. We then need to better monitor biodiversity and try to figure out how to integrate it into our public health and into our natural resource management. And that Finland study is a really good example of why we need large community-wide health data sets over longer periods of time that allow us to ask those kinds of questions. Now, in the US, we have a really hard time with this because of our privacy laws, but I figure there has to be a way that we can get these kinds of data made available to researchers so we can ask these kinds of really big, large-scale questions where you need a whole community's worth of data. And then obviously we need more work in aquatic, coastal, and wetland ecosystems on this whole biodiversity and nature exposure relationship, because there really are almost no studies out there, particularly when looking at biodiversity in these other settings. Okay, so the point of basically all of this, but particularly this last part, is science really can help society. In the 19th century, we had poor conditions, which actually led to really important improvements in our urban settings, so that we were providing better clean water and taking care of sewage in a different way. And so really, we want human health to be the central part of urban planning. And what we're learning here is that there now needs to be a role for how do we understand the way nature needs to be included in our urban planning so that human health is improved. And so what I think these results are suggesting is that there is this potential. Biodiversity may have this direct and positive impact on human health, which then means there's the potential to implement these findings to enhance both human well-being and to develop increased public support for biodiversity conservation and restoration, which I find really exciting. So I find that this is a very exciting time when there's a lot of science that can be done to help inform policy and lots of opportunities that combine conservation with improving community and ecosystem health. That said, it's also a very challenging time. As you all know, as the country, what direction do we really want to go in, and how do we try to include lots of different parts of our society in the way we move forward as a country? And I think now is the time that all of us must be incredibly vigilant and vocal as we move forward. So here are some suggestions, ways that you might want to consider getting involved and helping to move some of these efforts forward. And I'm hoping that at least one of these will resonate with each of you listening tonight. So one of these, as I said, is be vocal, and also we really need to work on limiting our greenhouse gas emissions. So tell your representatives that the U.S. must stick to its climate mitigation commitments from the Paris meeting. I'm putting this yellow phone number down because I discovered recently that this phone number, you don't have to know your representative's phone numbers. If you call this one phone number, it will take you to the Hill. And then you say whether you want the Senate or the House, and then it asks you for your zip code, and it takes you to your representative. So what is so great is that for anybody out there, you don't have to even know your representative's name, which I mean, I laugh at that now, but I never used to know my representative's name. And then I moved to the DC area and I suddenly realized I really needed to have a better sense of what that even meant. But you don't have to know your representative's name. This will get you there. And then there are very nice people on the end of the phone. Doesn't matter what party, they are always nice. And they take your message down. And calling has a much bigger impact than sending emails or even letters. So I highly encourage you to voice your opinion about everything from limiting our greenhouse gas emissions to anything else that might be on your mind, because they are always there and they really do want to hear from you, and they keep a tally. And even if your representative is already very much in line with your own political beliefs, they are keeping a tally of how many people call. So I have now programmed this number into my phone for the very first time. And I am planning to call this probably as often as once a week as needed in order to continue to voice my opinion and to use my right as a citizen to keep my representatives informed of what I think. Others. Climate change is not something we believe in. It is a fact. There's a lot of evidence behind it. And quite honestly, it's something that's already being felt by many of us. And if we're not feeling it, one of our neighbors likely is feeling it. And so this is not some far-off threat in the future. It is happening. It is now, and it is real. Help other people to understand that. When possible, invest in clean energy, wind and solar. Maybe buy carbon offsets if you found some way that you like to do that. And right now, everyone has an opportunity to, again, participate in your democracy, which is that, so as part of this administration's rethinking of all of our regulations in this country, under the regulatory reform that one of the executive orders has called for, EPA has this opportunity for public participation in regulatory reform. And so if you go to this page, again, the website's up there on the top of the screen, you can send an email. It says how to comment. You can email, or you can actually send snail mail too, and you can comment on what about the EPA you think is really valuable for the American public. And so this is your chance to say, hey, the Clean Water Act matters a great deal. No, I don't want to see it weakened. The Clean Air Act is incredibly important, and I don't want to see it weakened. Because if we don't voice our opinion at this point, then decisions are going to be made. This is our chance. This is the public participation in EPA's regulatory reform. So I really encourage all of you to go and comment, and encourage your friends and neighbors and students to comment as well, because this is an opportunity to participate in democracy. Okay, so we can also be working to protect and restore coastal natural infrastructure, both for its blue carbon benefits and its coastal resilience benefits. And if you contact your local estuary community, or your National Estuarine Research Reserve, or other communities on the coast, there are oftentimes opportunities to participate in restoration of interest to you. This can be a lot of fun, and you can feel really good about the work you did. We need to be thinking about incorporating natural ecosystems into our urban and community planning. So if any of you are connected to opportunities to inform your community's decisions, we have to be thinking more about the importance of open space, the importance of green space, and getting really creative, like maybe growing plants on the side of our buildings is an opportunity, or more green roofs. And then finally, if any of you work with children or have kids of your own, it's really important that they get outside and that they are exposed to a diversity of natural environments, because this is actually how the human immune system evolved. And if we don't expose them to all of those various settings, their immune system may not function properly, both as kids but also as adults. And diseases will emerge later in life that could have potentially been prevented by having that exposure earlier in life. So get your kids outside, let them get dirty. I sometimes have people say, wait, do you mean when you say expose them, you don't mean like take them to a hospital? No, I don't mean expose them in some hospital. I do mean expose them to a whole bunch of different natural settings, farms, and go for a hike, and go to the beach, and do it all, because that's all really good for your kids' immune systems. Okay, so we made it, we're here. We're at the end, and so basically I like to wrap up my presentation saying we have a lot of information at this point, and it really is up to society now. What do we want the future of our planet and the future of our coasts to look like? Because we have a lot of choices, and we need to be involved in the making of those decisions as we move forward. All right, and with that, I'm happy to take questions. My email address is there on the screen. My website is right there too. If you have any difficulty getting to any of the publications I mentioned and you want to see more details, please feel free to send me an email, but many of them are available open access at my website, although not all of them. So feel free to shoot me an email if you want any of the ones you're having trouble getting to. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you so much, Ariana. I'm so pleased that you were able to give us this presentation this evening.
You're welcome.
You know, we do have quite a few questions, and I'm going to leave your email address as well as your website up there. I would urge people not to leave. We have a series of educational resources that I'll be putting up, some of which that Ariana has provided, as well as some final closing announcements for folks that may have joined us late. One of the early questions that I have here is about what percentage of salt marsh carbon is stored each year, and about how much is lost in decomposition.
Yeah. So these systems are really impressive carbon sinks, but an awful lot of the carbon is actually still just being used by the plants or being decomposed, you know, by the microbes, etc. So at most, it's probably as high as 10%, but it's probably more like 5% of the carbon that is taken up is actually being stored long term. And that sounds like a small number, but interestingly, it's much higher than most of these. The percentage is maybe 1% or less of the total carbon being taken up that actually makes it into long-term storage. So even though it's a small percentage, it's actually still a very important amount, and it's much greater than most other ecosystems.
Thanks. And, you know, speaking of different ecosystems, how does the carbon sequestration in freshwater wetlands compared to, say, saltwater wetlands?
Yeah, so freshwater wetlands can also be really important carbon sinks. However, there is one important distinction there, and that is the fact that, hey, they're freshwater wetlands. So what distinguishes a freshwater wetland and a saltwater wetland is that in saltwater wetlands you have a bunch of sulfate that is coming from the ocean water. And the sulfate, it's very interesting. I did my postdoc on this, so I love it when people ask this question. So sulfate, the microbes that reduce sulfate from sulfate to hydrogen sulfide, which is actually what gives you that rotten egg smell sometimes in wetlands. So when you have a sulfate reduction, the microbes that do that process can actually outcompete the microbes that produce methane. And so when you have sulfate present, you tend to have very little, if any, methane production, and most of what's going on is sulfate reduction, which then doesn't produce a greenhouse gas. Well, so as you get fresher and fresher and fresher, and the tipping point is somewhere around 20 parts per thousand, so as you get fresher than 20 parts per thousand, you don't have as much sulfate around, and so suddenly you start to have a lot more methane production that's occurring. And methane is a greenhouse gas that is at least 25 times as powerful as CO2. So the problem is you might still have a lot of carbon dioxide being taken up and stored in freshwater wetlands, but it is possible that that storage is being offset by the production of methane, or in a wetland that's been polluted by nitrogen, you might actually be getting N2O, 150 as powerful a greenhouse gas as CO2. So the point is, a freshwater wetland may still be a very important carbon sink, but in order to ascertain if it's a carbon sink, you have to do a lot more complicated carbon measurements. So you have to look at not just the carbon going in, but also all the different greenhouse gases coming off. And in some cases, you do still get a sink. In fact, if it's a wetland that's been established for a very long time, typically it is still a greenhouse gas sink, but it's a bit harder to demonstrate that scientifically. Now, if it's a much newer freshwater wetland, it typically takes a while for the carbon stored to kind of offset the greenhouse gas emissions. And so again, that was sort of my point about protecting an intact wetland is really much better if we can do it than destroying or disturbing something and then deciding to try to restore it or recreate it. Because especially in freshwater settings, you will have a period where it actually is a source of greenhouse gases potentially before it becomes a sink again. Now again, for those coastal wetlands that are salty, they will become a sink basically right away. And so that's partly why NOAA's efforts have really focused on those saltier environments. But we do include tidal wetlands, including freshwater wetlands, in, for example, the greenhouse gas inventory, and in some of our efforts, like the VCS methodology, it's freshwater or salty coastal wetlands. But again, you just have to be very cautious about making sure you are accounting for things like methane production or N2O production that might be occurring, because that can offset any stored carbon, and then hence you've gotten rid of your greenhouse gas benefit.
Okay, so I have a few other questions here that are along these same lines. One of which is coming from Julia, and she asks that she never sees the loss of carbon from thawing permafrost being included in the carbon sink source comparisons. And where would this fit in, do you think? Is this go along the lines of what you've already described as far as the freshwater wetlands and the methane?
Well, so the permafrost is, I mean, it's somewhat similar. It is a freshwater system. Permafrost has been, decomposition there has been slowed because it's been frozen. So it's not that it's been slowed because it was salty, but it's been actually so cold that it hasn't had a lot of decomposition. And as the atmosphere warms and those systems thaw, we are actually creating then environments where those microbes are basically suddenly able to decompose things that they couldn't previously because it was too cold and things were frozen solid. So absolutely, the loss of permafrost and the greenhouse gases coming off of permafrost, particularly CO2 and I think methane too, are definitely of concern. And so that is definitely something that I think as another climate mitigation opportunity. I know that's being discussed at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change the same way that coastal wetlands are being discussed. I think one of the hardest things about permafrost is how do you stop, how do you manage permafrost if it's thawing? How do you try to stop that? Well, obviously we try to limit greenhouse gas accumulation in the atmosphere so that we limit climate change. But that is a massive management strategy, and it's much harder to have some kind of a local opportunity to manage and mitigate that change that's really occurring because of global changes. The really cool thing about coastal wetlands is that all that's happening there tends to be very locally manageable. Now, I'm not saying it's easy to stop destruction of those systems. It's not necessarily. Two examples of that: in parts of Southeast Asia, it is incredibly profitable to destroy mangroves and put in shrimp farms. And those shrimp farms tend to only last 5 to 10 years before they become diseased. But it's still very profitable to go in where there's not a lot of mangrove protection or enforcement of protection if there is supposedly protection. So, it's very profitable to just go in and destroy them, do the shrimp, and then move down the coast once those shrimp ponds have become diseased and you can't use them anymore. So I'm not saying it's easy to stop that process, but it is within a country's jurisdiction. It is a human action on a very local scale that's impacting that wetland, and so we could stop that loss. Another example of that is here in the United States. Now, this gets a little more complicated. For example, where we in the U.S. are losing the majority of our wetlands is in the Gulf, and it's actually 90% in Louisiana, basically. And the loss of wetlands there is because we have done an enormous modification to the Mississippi River in terms of hydrology and sediment. And so the coastal wetlands along the Gulf are partially dependent on sediment supplies coming down the Mississippi. And when we rerouted that hydrology in order to protect communities upstream from flooding, we have then created a case where we are starving our coastal wetlands there of the sediment that they need to be able to keep pace with sea level rise. So many coastal wetlands are getting some sediment, and then they're also shunting a bunch of carbon below ground and creating this organic substrate. And both of those contributions tend to be helping coastal wetlands to stay to basically keep pace with sea level rise. And in the case of the Gulf, we have starved them of their sediment supply. Now, that is still a relatively fixable problem, because in the Atchafalaya, where they've actually modified the hydrology so that we're sending Mississippi water there again, wetlands are actually building in the Atchafalaya. So we know that this is actually possible to restore sediment supplies, and coastal wetlands in the Gulf can become healthy and rebuild. But we're talking about a fairly major societal decision to change our sediment and hydrology management of the Mississippi in order to benefit those coastal wetlands. Still, it is potentially more doable than global warming solutions, where it has to be that solution. So my focus hasn't been on peatlands management, but that isn't to say that peatland loss is not important, because it is. It is another source of greenhouse gases that we need to be concerned about, and one that's probably just now coming on the horizon, and it's probably only going to get worse as the planet continues to warm.
Okay, because of our time, I think we just have a couple of more questions, and then we'll move on to some of our educational resources. One question is coming from our frequent attendee, Akadi, and she asks, is the carbon storage in the wetlands from sort of dead or buried plants, or are the plants pulling the carbon dioxide out of the air and storing it in the ground, and how are they in fact storing it? How does the plant do that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the answer is sort of yes to all of that. So basically, the plants do photosynthesis, and they take carbon out of the atmosphere and they make it into biomass, whether that's shoots, roots, leaves, whatever. And then some of that carbon and gets buried underground. Either roots die and become part of the soil, or litter or branches or whatever fall and become incorporated into the soil. And then because of those anaerobic conditions that I described, that organic matter decomposes incredibly slowly. So a lot of it gets buried and just stays buried, or very, very slowly decomposes. In some of these mangroves, you can dig fairly deep into the soil and you still find pieces of actual roots or even bark and trunk and pieces that are buried meters deep but are still basically intact when you go to dig them up when you're trying to take a soil core. And so basically decomposition is just slowed to such a point that that any organic carbon that then can make it into the soil and basically get buried stays and doesn't get decomposed. So that's how plants are taking it from the atmosphere, and then some of it gets incorporated into the soil where it stays.
Thanks. And getting on to sort of a question about the last part of your, or the latter part of your presentation, you mentioned a number of studies that showed that exposure to nature was needed for many of these health benefits, or was beneficial for many folks' health. And in some of these studies, do you know approximately how much exposure to nature was needed to sort of observe some of these effects?
Yeah, so that was partly why I mentioned this in my research needs. We really do not have a good sense of what the dosage needs to be for how much nature and how much biodiversity. This is very much just so brand new. I don't have a good answer to that. I mean, so in the case of the Finland adolescents, they assumed that the radius, the environment within a 3-kilometer radius was at least a proxy for the kinds of things that that child was experiencing just in being around their house and being outside their house. But again, we don't have a really good sense of, so did it, how much does it matter if the kid plays outside a whole bunch or only a little? We don't have answers for that, which is incredibly frustrating if you want to actually try to think about how to specifically improve health, which is why I think this is a really important research field. Now, I can tell you, and this is really cool, used to be called DC Parks prescription, and now I think they're just calling it ParkRx. So you can go look at, I think it's parkrx.org. This is actually an effort in the DC area that's being led by, I think, one particular doctor, but some others too. And the whole idea is that for some kids who are being prescribed, they're being told, okay, they're being, diagnosed with things like ADHD. This effort is trying to figure out how to give them a nature prescription to try to help with some of those behavioral issues in particular. And so the whole idea is, how can their families build more park time into their daily lives? And Park Prescription basically pulls up a map and says, where do you live at the park, the distance of you, and these are the different features of those parks. And I think it's really an exciting, again, new sort of opportunity to see how much we can treat those kinds of conditions, not necessarily with meds, or not with meds only, but also with getting kids outside, having them exercise, and just enjoy being outside in the natural world as part of trying to help them with some of those other behavioral challenges in particular. So I would check that out for more information, and there's a whole bunch of papers in the paper I wrote with Paul Sandifer, and that's on my website. And if you have more questions, going to some of those other papers, a lot of that stuff is very new. It's come out in the last few years, and I think it's super exciting, but there's still a lot we don't know about this because it's such a new field, and because it means we have to combine our understanding of the natural world and ecology with human health and human biology, and that means bridging fields. And anytime we try to do that interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary work, it's extra challenging, it's extra hard, but clearly it could have incredible benefits to society if we could figure out some of this understanding of nature dosage and biodiversity dosage.
Well, again, thank you again so much, Ariana, for your time this evening. I wish we had more time for questions. We only have a few more minutes left for our webinar this evening. I have a few resources that I just want to go over with everyone briefly. If you have a question for Dr. Sutton-Greer, please enter it into your question pane. I will make sure that Dr. Sutton-Greer gets a copy of those. We'll be sending them out, and hopefully she'll be able to get back to you in a reasonable amount of time, but you are one busy individual. The first few that I'd like everyone to see is Bringing Wetlands to Market. This is actually a coastal blue carbon curriculum that was developed by a number of ecosystem scientists as well as educators from the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. I highly recommend that you go and take a look at this. I believe that most or all of the resources that are in there, the activities, are linked to the NGSS. I think that it's a terrific resource to take a look at. Also, there are a series of radio shows and podcasts that Dr. Sutton-Greer has done, and the links are over here so you can listen to sort of some other aspects of some of the research that she's done. And we have here our NOAA Coastal Blue Carbon webpage if you'd like additional information about that, as well as the Blue Carbon Initiative website, which is an organization. If you're interested beyond the blue carbon area into looking at some of the natural green infrastructure information. There's sagecoast.org as well as ScienceDirect.com looking at the future of our coast, the potential for natural and hybrid infrastructure to enhance the resilience of our coastal communities, economies, and ecosystems. And I know I'm going through this really fast, but all of the slides and many of the references and notes on Dr. Sutton-Greer's slides are on our Google archive website. Moving along, I just want everybody to know, please go to your email. There's a link to our post-webinar poll. Go, just open it right after we're done here and complete it. We will be very, very appreciative. And save next June 5th for our next webinar. For those of you who showed up a little bit late, just wanted you to know again some of the professional development opportunities that are coming up. On May 13th, there's a half-day virtual conference through the National Science Teachers Association, the Dynamic Ocean. We'll be talking about Oceanography 101 and climate, sea level rise, changing ocean chemistry, coral reef bleaching, and species migration and changing fisheries. We have a workshop in Hawaii from June done in collaboration with the Hawaii Environmental Educators Association, June 8th through 10th. We've got one with Connecticut Sea Grant in Groton, Connecticut, July 11th through 13th. Resilience, it's not just surviving the zombie apocalypse. And on June 20th through 22nd in Fairbanks, Alaska, engaging youth in STEM and community resilience. If you can't make any of those because they're a little bit further away, if you're in the Maryland area, there's a NOAA and Made Clear Climate Education Academy. I will be sending out detailed information about these opportunities through the NOAA Climate Stewards listserv. The URL is down here, and you can get to our slides on the Google site. And I will close with this lovely moment of Zen that we have. And Ariana, if you're still on the line, can you describe the scene that we're looking at here?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, since I'm an East Coaster, when I travel to the West Coast, I tend to still wake up really early. And so I was in Santa Cruz and was up really early and got to see a really spectacular sunrise as a result. So that's always the benefit of traveling towards the West Coast.
Well, thanks, Ariana. I really appreciate you sending in our moment of Zen picture. And for all of us here in NOAA Climate Stewards, we hope that we will all keep moving forward toward the sun, toward the new day. And again, I thank you very much, Dr. Sutton-Greer, for joining us and presenting with us here this evening. To all of you,
you're welcome.
Have a good night.